I'm Rantasmo, and the gay deceivers needs more gay. The Gay Deceivers was released in 1969, just a month after the Stonewall Rebellion, and it imparts some decidedly pre-Stonewall values. In very much the same spirit as I Now Pronounce You Chuck and Larry and Boat Trip, the film concerns two straight guys, Danny and Elliot, who become enmeshed in an elaborate scheme that requires them to pose as gay lovers. But rather than doing this in order to resolve an insurance debacle, or have sex with women somehow, these characters do it in order to avoid being drafted into the Vietnam War.
What do you think about when you look at something like this?
Well, muscles have never been my bag, but...
And to an extent, that was a real thing that happened in the 1960s. Telling the draft board that you were gay was viewed as one of the more reliable methods for dodging the draft, though in actuality, it didn't work all that often. Gay guys actually had more difficulty convincing draft boards that they were gay than straight guys did, in part because the people on the draft boards were usually straight people who had certain ideas about what a gay man looked and acted like. And naturally, people who weren't actually queer and had those same stereotypes in mind were often better at replicating them. Of course, any men who did manage to convince the government that they were gay, whether or not they actually were, had to deal with the possibility of their families and employers finding out too. And at this particular time in American history, that stigma was a significant hurdle to say the least. Like a hurdle made of barbed wire and poverty. The Gay Deceivers attempts to transform this fairly dire real-life premise into a light and silly farce, often grossly stretching the limits of suspendable disbelief. The army places Danny and Elliot under surveillance because they have that kind of time and resources, which means that our protagonists are forced to cohabitate in a gay neighborhood next to a florid, mincing landlord played by Michael Greer. Greer is inarguably the film's strongest point.
Look what you've done to my peonies!
They're marigolds!
I may not know my flowers, but I know a bitch when I see one!
I can't exactly say that The Gay Deceivers was progressive for its time. It's firmly centered from a straight point of view, relies heavily on swishy stereotypes, and most of the quote-unquote humor basically amounts to, haha, look at all these flamers. If you don't find that sort of thing inherently hilarious, it's mostly pretty boring. Though it is kind of interesting to see how gay stereotypes have evolved over the last 50 years or so. Apparently in the 60s we all wore neck scarves and had really gaudy taste in furniture. Even so, the film does have a few unusually sympathetic quirks to it. Michael Greer was gay himself and apparently worked with a director and screenwriter to temper some of the script's more homophobic elements. Unlike other movies that depicted gay men as lonely and self-pitying, the gay characters here, the ones that get the most screen time anyway, seem to be in relatively happy monogamous relationships, even referring to themselves as married.
Seeing the two of you getting started like this is reminiscent of Malcolm and myself when we were first married.
Portraying happy, well-adjusted gay people is admirable, but what's unfortunate in this movie is that the gay men are happy-go-lucky to the point of absurdity. We're repeatedly shown the reality of anti-gay stigma in this movie. Heck, the entire premise of the movie hinges on it. But the gay characters seem completely ignorant of that. They don't persist in spite of flagrant bigotry so much as remain seemingly oblivious to its existence. Nor do our straight heroes seem to learn any sort of significant lesson from any of this. One of them actually loses his job as a lifeguard because his employer thinks he's gay. A practice that I will point out is still completely legal in many states. This could have been a nice object lesson for a protagonist to go, wow, it turns out that it's actually really tough being gay in this country. But we really don't get much sense of empathy from them at all. I guess that might be more than you could reasonably expect from a movie from this era, but it's a shame that this one came so close to expressing a pro-gay moral without ever quite following through. There's a twist at the end where it turns out that the army investigator and presumably the entire rest of the army was actually gay the whole time. And they were actually just making sure that Danny and Elliot weren't gay because they don't want straight people in the army. At first, this might seem kind of subversive, like it turns out that the gay people actually had the upper hand all along, but it mostly just comes across as a cringy denial of reality. As if LGBT people weren't being deeply, systematically oppressed in the 1960s. As if exclusively sending gay people to fight and die in the Vietnam War would somehow be better. The Gay Deceivers is not good by any stretch of the imagination, or even very entertaining, But it is a fascinating window into the way that gayness has been perceived. We've definitely come a long way since 1969, but unfortunately, some things haven't changed all that much. Sure, we can get married and join the army now, but being LGBT can still get you fired, discriminated against, or physically assaulted. This movie is from an era that I'm glad we've left behind, but it's also important that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. Interior design related or otherwise.